picture with me for a minute. It's a regular Tuesday morning, and your practice administrator or practice manager gets a phone call, and it's from Dr. Chen, let's say. And Dr. Chen happens to be one of the highest referring physician partners you have for your practice. And you're thinking he's calling to give you a new referral. Only the first question out of his mouth is, why didn't Susie Jones that I sent over last week ever get an appointment? Like, what happened to her? Where'd she fall out of the system? And your poor practice manager or administrator is sitting there kind of like a deer in the headlights without an answer, because they didn't even know that Susie was sent over, because most practices don't have any type of process in place to track referrals before they ever get into the system, which starts with them booking an appointment. So if I were to ask you right now, how many referrals that are sent over from your physician partners or even word of mouth actually become patients? They schedule, they get on the calendar, and they become a patient of your practice. You would likely answer somewhere between 80 and 95%. And why wouldn't they become a patient? They have a trusted referral from their primary physician or whoever that might be, and they've been sent directly to your office. So why would they take a detour? But what if I told you that number is actually closer to 50%? Does that grab your attention a little bit? Is that shocking? If that's the case, you want to tune into this week's episode, because that's exactly what we're going to dive into, is where those referral patients are disappearing. The reason that that number is likely lower than you think it is because there's no measurement in place at the moment for people who get a referral and then never show up at your office. Most practices don't measure that number because they don't have their pulse on the referrals that are being sent from their network. And when you don't have when you don't have a finger on those analytics and those numbers, it's really hard to know who isn't showing up and why they aren't showing up. And the situation with Dr. Chen is not a normal situation. Normally, those referrals that don't show up, you don't even know that they're not there, because they simply don't call, they don't book, they forget about you, they go to a different provider, they ask for feedback from friends and family on other physicians that they've used, and you've lost the relationship without ever knowing that it was even a possibility. If we haven't met yet, I'm Alisa Conner, and I help both professional services organizations and specialty medical practices grow, not by outspending their competitors, but instead by creating experiences that their patients and clients can't wait to talk about to others. There are 6 different ways that those referrals can disappear, and most practices aren't even looking at even 1 or 2 of these options. And so I want to bring it to your attention today because it may give you some insight on where you can identify leaks are happening within your own practice and then come up with a game plan about how to fix it. So the first place where referrals are lost is, I call it the no contact. The first place that potential patients disappear is in the no contact zone. And what this means is that they called and they wanted to get an appointment, and they were either put on hold and they hung up because they ran out of, they didn't have time to do it, or somebody needed to call them back because they were missing paperwork or whatever that might be. And a couple of days go by, their urgency is no longer there, and nobody follows up with the patient. Or when they do, the patient has lost interest or has moved on or has scheduled with someone else. And so this happens often because there are things that come up during the day, and more often than not, the people at the front desk are very overwhelmed and are constantly going in 100 different directions, including answering phones, checking people in, and all of the other duties that go with that job. So it's easy for people to fall through this crack. They reach out, they want to get an appointment, and something gets in the way. But if you're not aware of it as a practice, or you don't know how to fix it as a practice, you're losing referrals right then and there. The second place that you could be losing referrals is the endless voicemail loop. Now, If your practice specifically works with generations that never answer their phone, and that is anybody that's a millennial or younger, and maybe even Gen X and younger, you could be experiencing what I call the endless voicemail loop. Your office calls a couple of times, they leave a voicemail saying, hey, we heard from Dr. Chen. We want to make sure that we get you on the calendar. But the protocol is like, don't call more than twice. So they never call back or they don't reach the person they're trying to call. And so they end up in an endless voicemail loop, or you go back and forth and it's almost impossible after 2, 3, 4, 5 voicemails to get a hold of someone and get them on the calendar. So if you don't have a protocol in place to reach out to those potential patients, you're also losing them due to referral leakage. And that is the second place that a lot of practices start to lose referrals. The third place that you can be losing referrals is when authorizations expire. So you get an insurance authorization and it's only good for a certain amount of time. The patient gets busy. They decide they're going to live with the pain a little longer. Maybe they don't have the financial means after they find out their deductible is, whatever it might be. But in the meantime, between when they get that first pre-authorization and then when they finally get in and decide to do something about what's going on with them, the authorization is expired and you have to start the paperwork over again. And sometimes that delay is enough friction for that patient to just go, it's not worth it. And then you're back in the same spiral that you were before, where if you could have just gotten them in and scheduled right away because they were authorized, they would be on the books and be turning into a patient. And they can lead into any of the other two referral loss categories that we just talked about. You can be on endless voicemails with them, or they can be trying to schedule and nobody gets back to them, or you keep missing each other. The fourth area that practices experience referral loss is with their competitors. Now, there are 7 different areas where practices can experience leakage, and we're just talking about referrals today. But this kind of bleeds over into one of the areas, and that is that you can have word of mouth referrals, yes, and so you may lose some patients there, but what practices often don't realize is that their online reputation is also not up to par with their competitors, and they're losing patients that way, whether it is too hard to schedule online, or their website is outdated, or they don't have good reviews that nobody's responded to. It could be any number of things that it could be tarnishing your reputation without you even being aware of it. And if no one in your office has the time or has the responsibility over that reputation management, then you are losing patients. You are losing patients to your competitors, and you may not even know why you're losing them or how to get them back. And then the last place that practices can often lose patients is what I call the quiet walk away. And that means that, they've tried this referral has tried to schedule. Maybe they called, they got a busy signal, and so they try to go online and it was too hard to actually get an appointment, or there were no appointments available, or maybe they filled out the entire form and nobody got back to them, because a lot of times I'll see online forms that people have on their websites. And then when I go into the practice and I say, hey, where do these forms go? Nobody knows. And then they start to investigate where those forms are going, and they realize they have hundreds of forms that are filled out that nobody got back to those people. Those are all referrals and patients that they could have had, that nobody had it in their wheelhouse to go and check for that form because the website person set that up and never told them where it went or who was responsible for it. Or maybe that was a previous employee knew all of that information, and that knowledge information wasn't passed on to the new person. Any number of things can happen here. But in the meantime, you're losing referrals. The hard part about all of this is that there's not one person to be blamed for any of these scenarios. Everyone is doing their job. They're doing the best that they can, and they're following the processes that they have in place or that their predecessor taught them on. There isn't necessarily visibility into where these patients are going or that they even exist. And part of that is because more often than not, there's no visibility into when they're sent over, by whom, and where that potential patient is in the process. That isn't a performance problem. That's a visibility problem for your practice. And it's one that is very fixable. And the reason that it's a visibility challenge is that those missed patients don't complain. They don't require work tickets. They don't call. They aren't online filling out reviews. They just simply disappear and go somewhere else or just manage the problem long term on their own. And nearly every practice is simply measuring who comes in the door and becomes a patient, not who was sent there and who's getting lost along the way. And that's really where this invisible referral loss is happening. And it's costing practices lots and lots of money. We're going to dive into the math specifically in a little later in this episode. So stick with me. And you're also going to get the opportunity to do your own math, which is even more helpful because then it's specific to your practice. So you may be wondering, like, how did Alisa come upon this whole idea of referral loss and referral leakage in a different perspective than what it's normally talked about in? And how I came upon this was I started to do some assessments and work with specialty medical practices, and I realized there were a lot of repeating patterns. And my work with corporate and professional service organizations showed very similar patterns. And so it was easy for me to recognize it in a new industry. And what I kept running across was that everyone was experiencing a lot of the same problems. They had gaps in their schedule that they couldn't account for. They had referrals that were referral partners who used to send them constant referrals, and those relationships either slow down or the referrals just stop coming. And when we went to look for the numbers on the referrals, there was this giant glaring gap of like, okay, well, Dr. Chen is sending over 100 referrals a week. Only like 3 people are scheduling a month. What is happening to all the other people? And nobody had the answer. And so the reason nobody had the answer was because nobody had ever asked the question before. When I prepare for these episodes, I always try and go pull some metrics. And the benchmark metric that I pulled was just an overall metric for healthcare in general, that about half of referrals that are sent over end up scheduling. The other half disappear somewhere along the way. And if you dive into more particulars on specialties, that number actually increases quite a bit. And it can be that over 70% or 80% of referrals sent over never become a patient. When you get into those numbers and you start to multiply that on your average case revenue, those numbers can be pretty significant. When I started looking at larger health organizations and some of the statistics around that, those statistics showed that 34% of or less of referred patients ever made it to the practice and got on the calendar. And so you could see why there's a significant challenge right there, and that if nobody knows that number exists, it's never being addressed. So those benchmark numbers, you may be thinking, well, that doesn't really apply to us. We're not big healthcare, or we're not a orthopedic office, or whatever it might be. But I'll bring you back to the question, which is, what is your number? When was the last time you calculated that number? If you're like most people listening to this episode, you probably don't know the answer to that question. And if you don't know it, you can't improve it because you can't improve what you aren't tracking. And chances are pretty high you didn't even see the problem until you started listening to this episode and you're like, oh, Nelly, we have challenges that we need to deal with. The deeper issue isn't the specific benchmarks and statistics that I throw out in this episode to kind of guide the math that we're going to do in a minute, because we have to start somewhere. It's that most administrators are running on the assumed number that every referral that's sent over, or at least the majority of them, is becoming a patient. And that's where I want to challenge your thinking a little bit, because chances are you likely haven't had the time or the opportunity to change that assumption or even challenge that assumption. So if you tune into this show regularly, you know that I love to help you use math in a way that gets you quick results and answers for your own practice and your own business. And that's no different than today. So if we are looking at a 90-day window for your practice, because 90 days is a pretty good, it's an achievable metric for you to track, and it's a pretty good indicator of where things sit over a extended period. So if you want to track this further and you have the time to do that, by all means, you should do that, because it never hurts to not only start tracking it, but to continue tracking it so you can see if there's improvement. But if you were to take just 90 days, so maybe you look at Q1 of this year and you pull your 90 days, because we're not quite through the second quarter. And so it might be a little bit more challenging, depending on when you're listening to this episode, to pull your numbers. But pull the last 90 days. And then when you're looking at those numbers, you're just going to look at two things. The two places that I want you to do some measuring around is the referrals you received and the referrals that have made it onto the calendar and completed with your practice in the perspective of getting a scheduled appointment. Just those two numbers: received, scheduled. And you can create a spreadsheet, whatever works for you to track those numbers. We're not going to look at numbers like not scheduled, not seen, actually seen, things like that. That's another episode. And today we're just looking at these two simple columns because I want to give you the ability to have some awareness around where your practice sits when it comes to this specific referral leakage right now. So if you're like most practices, you're probably going to struggle a little bit just finding those two numbers. And the reason is that the number where I ask you to go find the number of referrals received isn't usually tracked anywhere. And so if you're not tracking it anywhere, it's really hard to know what to put in that column. And finding where your referrals are coming in from, and if anybody's tracking like every specific partner, or are they word of mouth, and are you tracking that in the system, and who's tracking it, and is it all in one place, can get very convoluted very quickly. It just got convoluted in the sentence that I had right before this. So if you are experiencing that, I want to reassure you that you're not alone. And if you're like most practices, it never even occurred to you that you should be tracking that number at all. So give yourself a little grace if you're not tracking it, and also pat yourself on the back for now having an awareness around what you should be tracking. Because if you can't identify that number, it's going to be really hard for you to move forward with the math. But it also puts it front of mind for you and your office to know we need to be, for the next 90 days, tracking who is sending over referrals, how many are they sending, are they making it on the schedule, all of those different things. The good news about this is that you don't need some complicated piece of software to do this. You can do this in a shared spreadsheet or a tally sheet or whatever works for your practice. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's two columns. It's how many have come, how many scheduled. And if you can track that data for 90 days and have everybody in your office track it in the same place, it's going to give you so much awareness around what's actually happening in your practice. And it may be a little shocking at first when you realize how much revenue and how many patients are falling through the crack. But again, you can't fix a problem if you don't have awareness around it and you don't know where the problem is happening. The good news is once you start tracking this, you not only have awareness, but you're more than likely going to be ahead of everybody else in your industry, because most practices aren't tracking this. And so if you're doing it, you're seeing the leaks and you're starting to realize that you have to fix the problem. The other practices aren't even aware of it. They're still just letting referrals fall through the cracks. And so it puts you one step ahead of where they are by simply tracking it. So if we were going to apply the math, and we wanted to just do a simple equation so that you can get an idea of what this might look like for your practice. Let's just look at this in a very conservative manner. If you have 100 referrals that you receive every month, and we're going to use the benchmark rate that half of those people, so 50 of those people, never make it onto the calendar, never come into your office, never get a hold of anybody, whatever that may be. Half of them. So that's 50. If they don't complete and get on the schedule, and your average immediate revenue from a prospective patient is a very conservative $500. Usually it's much more than that. For example, orthopedics is around $6,500 a patient. Use the numbers for your practice is the point here. $500 may be very, very low. 6,500 may be very, very high. You are going to know what that math is for you. But if we're using that $500 and we're losing per patient and you're losing 50 patients a month, that's 25 grand a month that you're losing out on patients that never made it onto the calendar. And if you multiply that times 12, that's a significant amount of money for any practice. If we're looking at $25,000 a month times 12 months, it's $300,000 a year. Now, mind you, some of the other research I've done is that a lot of times you don't just have one referral partner. So if that's just one referral partner that is sending you 100 referrals a month and half of those people are leaving, and then you have 10 referral partners, well, you can multiply that 300,000 times 10 and you're at 3 million, which is a significant amount of money. And regardless of practice size, either of those numbers is a lot of money that is just slipping through the cracks. The other part of this that practices don't take into consideration is the downstream revenue for those patients. We just calculated this amount on the initial lowest possible denominator for a patient to come into the practice. But if you're, say, an orthopedic surgeon, you have quite a propensity for patients to continue working with you, whether it's through imaging or casting or peripherals or PT or whatever it might be, so that long-term patient value is much, much higher. And mind you, like we didn't even calculate it at a regular amount that a orthopedics office would charge. So I just want to make you aware of that. If you are an orthopedic office, you know that those numbers are very, very different for your office. And if you're an OBGYN office, you know what your numbers are. The point of the math equation isn't to say everybody is in the same boat. It's to bring an awareness to you on how many patients you're losing for your office and then calculating it on the correct numbers for your office. Most practices are highly focused on generating new leads. And I 100% believe generating new leads is not only important, it's necessary, but generating new leads with, say, digital advertising or social media is normally far under the amount of patients that arrive to a practice via referrals. Most practices think what they have is a volume problem, whether that's a volume problem around a number of referrals or a volume problem around the number of patients being added to the practice through lead generation. But what they don't realize is that the volume isn't the problem. The problem is that you're putting all of those leads or referrals into a leaky bucket. And if the bucket leaks aren't fixed, you're just going to be adding more water in the way of new patients or leads into a bucket that can't and won't deliver better results. If you were to ask a practice administrator or a practice manager how many referrals become patients, they likely would have that answer or could get that answer really quickly. The volume of those referrals is visible. Like it's if somebody's referred in and they become a patient, you can count that. You can determine whether or not a patient came from a referring physician or a previous patient or whatever that might be. You can add those numbers together very easily. Whether you have those top of mind or you need to go pull the data quickly from wherever you're storing it, it's likely readily available. And you may even, in that same scenario, have a process in place where you reach out to thank the referring physician. More often than not, when I look at practices, that process also doesn't exist, as well as keeping those physicians in the loop about their current patients. And oftentimes it's just because whether the process doesn't exist or it's not optimized or somebody hasn't taken responsibility for it, it isn't happening. So that could be a prime example of a hole in your bucket. How often do you think a referring physician is going to continue to send you patients when they're either not recognized for sending you a patient or they're not kept in the loop with their existing patient and the treatment they're getting from you? So tracking referrals that become patients is very visible. But where the struggle comes from referral leakage is tracking the actual referrals that come in the door that aren't becoming patients, because that's invisible and you can't track something you can't see or that you aren't monitoring. And so that leads practices to believe they just need to generate more leads. We just need more people coming in the door. When in reality, what they need is to fix the problem of tracking referrals that are coming in the door or on their way to their door that are never making it there and never getting on the calendar, which leads to another solution that oftentimes practices try to implement. And that's, we're not getting enough referrals, so let's reach out to our referral partners, see what's going on, and implement a new referral campaign that incentivizes our partners to send people to us. And although in practice you may think that's working, they may continue to send you referrals and you may have some of those people book appointments, but it still doesn't solve the problem. Because if there's a hole in the bucket, for example, scheduling with your practice is challenging, if not impossible. It's not going to move the needle for how many more referrals are coming in the door. It's not going to change the overall challenge you have with keeping the schedule full. It's not going to change your revenue numbers because you aren't changing the behavior that's causing the leakage to begin with. So if we were to look at a prime example of this, I reviewed a orthopedic practice probably just about a year ago. And they came to me, it's a physician-owned practice, and they came to me saying, hey, our schedules aren't full. We're spending all of this money on marketing, and yet we're losing out to our competitors. We have great docs, we have great credentials, we have great cover stories, yet our calendars are empty. Like, what the heck is happening? We have referral partners. We're doing all the things right. That's what I kept hearing from them. We think we're doing all the things right. But what they were missing out on was that, yes, they had 6 offices, but among those 6 offices, they had no online scheduling. They were trying to compete with PE-owned firms that offered not only online scheduling, but day of scheduling. And the scheduling that they did have on their website went to a form that got sent to an inbox that nobody had checked in months. So even if people were filling out a form, which the conversion rate on a form fill out is nil at this point, nobody was following up with those people. And then they had one other hindrance. They had 6 offices with 2 receptionists doing scheduling. So they would have people calling the office to book an appointment and they couldn't get through. They would either get a busy signal, they would be put on hold, and then the hold times were ridiculously long. And so people would just hang up and go to someone else. So the problems that they thought that they were solving by increasing lead generation and running more ads and having more social media campaigns and doing more things in the community weren't solving the actual problem. Because whether they got in front of more people or not, the leaky bucket that they had set up still had holes in it. And you can't get more people through the door when they're falling through the holes in your bucket. And yet nobody knew why. Nobody knew why this was happening. It was because they weren't looking at the problem from a different perspective to be able to see where the challenges actually existed in their practice. Now, before you go and run a new referral campaign or decide to throw a bunch of money on ads because your agency has told you Facebook ads are the place to be, I want you to take a minute and think about your numbers. Think about where the holes in your bucket might be right now and how many people are actually falling through the cracks that are potential referrals. The other part of this that I didn't talk about is that when you have referrals coming to you, you are overcoming a lot of the objections and challenges that cold traffic require you to meet before they ever even consider booking an appointment. When you have a referral coming to you, you have a built-in trust factor coming from that physician partner who has already built you up in their mind as the perfect solution to help them get and achieve the health that they want. When you're reaching out with cold advertising, whether it be Facebook, a social media post, or just randomly at a sports game, you don't have that built-in trust created. You're having to start from scratch, which means the conversion rate of that happening extends longer and longer. Your sales cycle becomes longer and longer, which requires you staying in front of those people even longer. And if you're not doing those things, then a lot of that effort, a lot of that time, and a lot of that money is simply wasted. If we were to return back to the example that started this episode, and we were looking at the receptionist who got a call from Dr. Chin, and we were to look at it from a different lens and not as a complaint, but as an indicator of our referral challenge, we may look at it through a different lens now. We may be seeing it from the perspective of, hey, we probably do have enough referrals coming in, but there's a place where we're losing them now. And there's not a system in place for us to track where we're losing them. And perhaps that is worth another glance and determining exactly how many people are falling through the cracks and what is it costing us. Most practice administrators can probably give you a ballpark idea of how many referrals they get every month, every quarter, every year. And they can likely tell you which patients came from referrals because they're probably tracking that in some way, shape, or form. But more often than not, what they can't tell you is the number of referrals that came over that never went anywhere. And if you can't tell me that second number, then you're just guessing what your referral completion rate actually is. And so if you're struggling with that second number and you don't know your referral completion rate, that's a great place to start. And if you're like most practice administrators, you probably don't know that number. And you actually probably don't even know how to calculate that number. And what's really powerful about having that number is that it opens so many pathways for you to make changes in your practice. The first being is having that number gives you the opportunity to get in front of your physician owners, your C-level leadership, and whoever makes big decisions about how to make changes in your practice with a very tangible, realistic number of what's happening in your practice. The second is that it makes you aware of how you're going about growing the practice and revenue for your practice and questioning whether or not you're actually investing in the right things so that you can put a stop to things that aren't delivering new patients and instead focus on where the patients that are showing up are going. And I wanted to make it very easy for you to calculate those numbers for your practice. And so in order for you to do that, I created a worksheet. And the worksheet walks you through how to find the numbers, how to calculate the basic numbers, and then gives you the output of how much money it's costing your practice. There's a sample on one side of the worksheet, so you can work through just statistical data if you don't have data from your practice, or as you collect data, you can see how you're comparing to the averages for referral loss in the specialty medical field as a whole. And so to grab that worksheet, you can do so with the link below in the description of the show, or you can go and get your copy at alisaconner.com/worksheet. But I highly recommend you start with that worksheet because when you have those numbers, it makes it much easier and more tangible for you to go put your ideas and solutions in front of the powers that be to make decisions. The nice thing about this worksheet is that it gives you your answers in 5 minutes or less, depending on if you've done a little homework before you open up the worksheet. And it gives you the power to then know where you stand, know where you want to go, and reevaluate some of the things that you're doing for your practice to increase growth, increase referral activities, and also increase revenue for your practice. So thanks for tuning in this week. I hope that you will go grab that worksheet so that you can do the math for your practice as well. And we're going to have a few more episodes coming up about referral leakage, just so you can get an idea of what these numbers look like across different specialty practices. They do vary quite a bit depending on the practice. So if you have a practice that you want me to highlight in one of those episodes, leave a comment below and let me know what specialty type practice you have, and I will go pull the math and we'll do an episode exactly on that. In the meantime, you can grab the worksheet with the pinned comment. The top comment will be pinned with the link. And if you've enjoyed this episode, I would love for you to share it with someone else who would find value from it. In the meantime, take care, be well, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.